In the autumn of 1449, the Ming Dynasty stood at the pinnacle of its power. For nearly a century, Chinese armies had pushed back the steppes, built magnificent cities, and commanded tribute from kingdoms across Asia. The Yongle Emperor had moved the capital to Beijing, creating a symbol of imperial might that would endure for centuries. But in a matter of days, this seemingly invincible empire would face its greatest crisis, a disaster so complete that it would reshape the course of Chinese history forever. The Tumu crisis represents one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in Chinese imperial history. In a single battle, the Ming Dynasty lost not only its most elite army, but its emperor himself. To understand how this catastrophe unfolded, we must first understand the world of 15th century China. Emperor Zheng ascended to the throne in 1435 at the age of just 9 years old. Born Zhu Qizhen, he would rule during what many considered the golden age of the Ming Dynasty. But behind the facade of imperial power, dangerous currents were already stirring. The Ming Empire stretched from the tropical south to the harsh northern frontiers, where nomadic tribes had threatened Chinese civilization for millennia. The most dangerous of these were the Mongols, descendants of Genghis Khan's empire, now fragmented but still formidable. By 1449, the Mongols had begun to reunite under a charismatic leader named Esen Taishi. Unlike the scattered tribal raids of previous decades, Esen represented a coordinated threat. He had the vision and military skill to challenge the Ming Dynasty directly. While Emperor Zhengtong held the title of Son of Heaven, real power lay in the hands of the court eunuchs, particularly Wang. A former teacher who had risen to become the emperor's most trusted advisor, Wang wielded unprecedented influence over imperial policy. The eunuch system was both the strength and weakness of the Ming Dynasty. These castrated court officials, theoretically unable to establish dynasties of their own, were meant to serve as loyal administrators. But Wang had accumulated power that rivaled that of the emperor himself. For decades, the Ming strategy toward the Mongols had been one of containment and diplomacy. Tribute payments, trade agreements, and occasional military expeditions had kept the northern frontier relatively stable. But Esen Taishi's growing power would soon test this delicate balance. In the grasslands beyond the Great Wall, a new force was emerging. Esen Taishi, regent of the northern Yun dynasty, had spent years consolidating Mongol tribes under his banner. Unlike his predecessors, Esen understood that to defeat the Ming, he needed more than swift horses and fierce warriors. He needed strategy. Esen was not just a military leader. He was a political genius. He understood the Ming court's weaknesses, their overconfidence, their reliance on tribute relationships, and most importantly, their belief that the Mongols would never dare attack the imperial heartland directly. The crisis began not with armies but with diplomacy. In 1449, Esen sent envoys to Beijing demanding increased tribute payments and more favorable trade terms. The Ming court, accustomed to dictating terms to barbarian tribes, was insulted by these demands. The Ming court's response was catastrophically arrogant. Not only did they refuse Esen's demands, but they also reduced the size of his diplomatic mission and cut tribute payments. From Esen's perspective, this was not just an economic loss, it was a public humiliation. Wang, the powerful eunuch advisor, convinced Emperor Zhengtong that the Mongols needed to be taught a lesson. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of dynasties. In July 1449, Esen launched a coordinated assault on multiple fronts. Mongol armies struck at Datong, Shunfu, and other strategic fortresses along the northern frontier. The speed and coordination of the attack caught the Ming forces completely off guard. This wasn't a typical nomadic raid. Esen had studied Chinese military tactics and knew exactly where to strike. His forces bypassed heavily fortified positions and struck at supply lines and communication centers. Within weeks, the entire northern frontier was in chaos. Reports flooded into Beijing of fortress after fortress falling to the Mongol onslaught. The carefully constructed defense system that had protected the Ming Dynasty for generations was crumbling before an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. As news of the Mongol victories reached the Forbidden City, Emperor Zheng faced the greatest crisis of his reign. His advisors were divided, some counseled patience and defensive measures, others demanded immediate action. But it was Wang who would make the decision that sealed the dynasty's fate. Wang saw this crisis as an opportunity to enhance his own power and legacy. He convinced the young emperor that personal leadership was necessary, that the Son of Heaven must lead his armies against the barbarian threat. It was a decision that would prove catastrophic. In August 1449, Emperor Zheng announced his intention to personally lead an expedition against Esen's forces. The imperial army that assembled was magnificent, over 500,000 men, including the elite imperial guard, the finest cavalry units, and artillery corps equipped with the latest firearms technology. On paper, the Ming army was overwhelmingly superior. They had better armor, more advanced weapons, and vastly superior numbers. But armies are not won on paper, they re-won through leadership, strategy, and understanding your enemy. The expedition was a logistical marvel. Thousands of supply wagons carried food, ammunition, and equipment for the massive army. Court officials, hoping to curry favor with the emperor, joined the expedition. Even Wang Zhen's personal servants and luxury items were included in the train. The imperial army began its march north in late August. From the beginning, problems plagued the expedition. The sheer size of the force made it slow and unwieldy. Supply lines stretched for miles, creating vulnerable targets for Mongol raiders. The Ming army was following a predictable route toward the fortress of Datong. Esen, with his superior intelligence network and mobile forces, could track their every movement. The Chinese were walking into a trap, and they didn't even know it. As the army moved north, Mongol harassment increased. Supply convoys were attacked, messengers were intercepted, and isolated units were picked off by swift cavalry raids. The massive Chinese army began to bleed from 1,000 small wounds. By early September, even Wang Zhen could see that the situation was deteriorating. Reports from the front lines spoke of empty fortresses, vanished enemies, and supply shortages. The decision was made to begin a tactical withdrawal to Beijing. The retreat should have been the end of the crisis. The Ming army was still largely intact, and Beijing's defenses were formidable. But Wang Zhen's personal ambitions would doom the expedition. He insisted on a detour to his hometown of Huailai, hoping to impress the locals with the imperial presence. The detour to Huailai was militarily inexcusable. It took the army further from safety and deeper into territory that Esen could easily control. What should have been a strategic withdrawal became a meandering parade through hostile territory. This detour perfectly illustrates the disconnect between the Ming court's perception of reality and actual conditions on the ground. They still believed they were the dominant force, that the Mongols would never dare attack the imperial army directly. As the army struggled through the detour, discipline began to break down. Units became separated, supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and morale plummeted. The magnificent force that had left Beijing was becoming a vulnerable rabble. On September 1, 1449, the imperial army reached the area around Tumu fortress, about 70 miles northwest of Beijing. What they found there was not the safe haven they expected, but the killing ground that Esen had prepared for them. Tumu was perfectly chosen by Esen. The terrain limited the Chinese army's ability to maneuver, while providing excellent positions for Mongol cavalry. More importantly, Esen had spent weeks preparing his forces for this exact confrontation. The Chinese army, exhausted from weeks of marching and harassment, made camp near the fortress. They were unaware that Esen's entire force, perhaps 100,000 of his best warriors, was converging on their position. Dawn broke on September 1, 1449, revealing the full scope of the disaster facing the Ming army. Mongol forces had surrounded the Chinese position during the night, cutting off all escape routes. The trap was complete. The Battle of Tumu began at dawn with a coordinated Mongol assault from multiple directions. The Chinese, caught in their camp with no room to maneuver, were immediately at a disadvantage. Their superior numbers meant nothing when they couldn't deploy effectively. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. Mongol cavalry struck at the Chinese lines with devastating effect, while their archers rained arrows down on the trapped army. The Ming forces, despite their better equipment, were being systematically destroyed. What made Tumu particularly devastating was the complete breakdown of Chinese command and control. Officers were cut down, units became separated, and the coordinated defense that might have saved the army never materialized. As the battle raged, Emperor Zheng found himself increasingly isolated. His bodyguards fought desperately to protect him, but the Mongol noose was tightening around the imperial position. The capture of the emperor was the ultimate catastrophe. In Chinese political theory, the emperor was the son of heaven, the link between earth and the divine realm. His capture by barbarians was not just a military defeat, it was a cosmic disaster. When the fighting finally ended, the magnitude of the disaster became clear. The cream of the Ming army lay dead on the battlefield. Wang, the architect of the expedition, was among the fallen. And Emperor Zheng, the son of heaven himself, was a prisoner of the Mongols. The Battle of Tumu lasted only one day, but its consequences would echo through Chinese history for centuries. In a single afternoon, the Ming Dynasty lost its emperor, its best generals, and its most elite military units. The numbers are staggering. Contemporary sources suggest that over 100,000 Chinese soldiers died at Tumu, including hundreds of high-ranking officers and court officials. It was one of the most complete military disasters in Chinese history. News of the disaster reached Beijing within days, throwing the capital into unprecedented crisis. The imperial court faced an impossible situation. Their emperor was a prisoner, their best army was destroyed, and Mongol forces were advancing on the capital itself. The immediate question was succession. Emperor Zheng had a young son, but he was just an infant. In this crisis, the court decided to install the emperor's brother, Zhu Qiyu, as the new emperor. He would become known as Emperor Jingtai. As Esen's forces approached Beijing, the new emperor and his advisors faced a terrible choice. Should they ransom the captured emperor, negotiate with the Mongols, or fight to the death? The decision would define the dynasty's response to its greatest crisis. The defense of Beijing was led by Yu Qian, one of the most capable ministers in Chinese history. He made the crucial decision to resist Mongol demands and organize the defense of the capital. It was a decision that would save the dynasty. The siege of Beijing became a desperate struggle for survival. Citizens joined soldiers on the walls, while officials melted down palace treasures to fund the defense. The entire city became a fortress. Esen's siege of Beijing lasted for several days in late September 1449. The Mongol leader had achieved everything he had dreamed of. He had the Chinese emperor as his prisoner and the imperial capital under siege. Victory seemed within his grasp. But Esen discovered that capturing territory is different from conquering it. Beijing's walls were strong, its defenders were desperate, and the Mongols lacked the siege equipment necessary for a prolonged assault. The siege became a test of wills. After several days of fighting, Esen made a crucial decision. Rather than risk his army in a costly siege, he would withdraw with his prisoner and enormous amounts of loot. Beijing was saved, but the emperor remained a captive. Emperor Zhengtong's captivity among the Mongols would last for over a year. During this time, he lived in a world completely different from the luxury of the Forbidden City, experiencing the harsh realities of nomadic life. The emperor's treatment by the Mongols was relatively humane. Esen understood that his prisoner was more valuable alive than dead, and he hoped to use Zhengtong as a bargaining chip in future negotiations with the Ming court. Throughout 1450, complex negotiations took place between the Ming court and Esen's representatives. The Mongol leader demanded enormous ransoms, territorial concessions, and renewed tribute payments. The Ming court, now led by Emperor Jingtai, was reluctant to meet these demands. The diplomatic situation was unprecedented in Chinese history. How do you negotiate for the return of an emperor who has already been replaced? The very existence of two emperors, one captive, one ruling, created a constitutional crisis. Finally, in August 1450, Emperor Zhen was released. The ransom paid was enormous, but the Ming Dynasty had survived its greatest crisis. However, the returned emperor would find that his world had changed forever. Zhengtong's return created new problems. Emperor Jingtai had established himself as the legitimate ruler, and he was reluctant to step aside for his brother. The crisis that began with military disaster was now becoming a political struggle for the throne. The Tumu crisis fundamentally transformed Ming military and diplomatic strategy. Never again would a Chinese emperor personally lead an expedition against the nomads. The disaster had taught the dynasty the dangers of overconfidence and imperial adventurism. The Ming response to Tumu was to adopt a much more defensive posture. They strengthened the Great Wall, improved their intelligence networks, and developed new military technologies. The dynasty had learned from its catastrophe. The political consequences of Tumu continued to unfold for years. In 1457, Emperor Jingtong regained his throne in a palace coup, becoming the only emperor in Chinese history to rule twice. His brother, the former Emperor Jingtai, was deposed and later died under mysterious circumstances. Zhengtong's restoration was controversial, but it resolved the constitutional crisis created by his capture. However, the trauma of Tumu would haunt his second reign. He never again displayed the confidence and ambition that had led to the disaster. The crisis of the Tumu fortress marked a turning point in Chinese history. The Ming Dynasty survived, but it was forever changed. The confident, expansionist empire that had dominated East Asia became more cautious, more defensive, and more aware of its limitations. Tumu represents one of those pivotal moments that reshape not just military history, but the entire trajectory of a civilization. The Ming Dynasty would continue for nearly 2 more centuries, but it would never again display the supreme confidence that characterized its early years. The crisis also demonstrated the importance of competent leadership and realistic assessment of military capabilities. The disaster was not inevitable, it was the result of specific decisions made by specific individuals at crucial moments. The crisis of the Tumu fortress stands as one of history's most dramatic examples of how quickly fortune can change in warfare and politics. In a single day, the most powerful empire in the world was brought to its knees by an enemy it had underestimated. The lessons of Tumu echo through the centuries. The dangers of overconfidence, the importance of understanding your enemy, and the critical role of competent leadership are as relevant today as they were in 1449. The crisis of the Tumu fortress reminds us that no empire, no matter how powerful, is immune to catastrophe. The Ming Dynasty's survival after Tumu was due not to its military might, but to the resilience of its people and the wisdom of leaders who learned from disaster. Today, visitors to the area around Tumu Fortress can still see the landscape where one of history's most decisive battles was fought. The fortress itself is largely gone, but the lessons of that September day in 1449 remain as relevant as ever. The crisis of the Tumu fortress changed the course of Chinese history and stands as a testament to the unpredictability of human affairs. In the end, it was not just a military defeat, but a reminder that even the mightiest empires must remain humble before the forces of history.
Thanks for watching.